Have you ever wondered what the deal is with these people called punks and why anyone would listen to punk music? Like, what exactly is the artistic value of it, and what about the whole punk scene would interest someone in it? Well, I am the Scallywag Artist, and here in this monologue, I am going to help you to understand the art of punk and exactly what value it brings to the arts and lifestyle in general as well. There are a few basic principles of the whole punk scene that I'm going to explain to you here in this monologue that will really help you to understand what it is all about and why it is the way that it is and why it is valuable. Okay. And the first number one that I consider to be the most important aspect is the genuine authenticity and the embracing of imperfections instead of fakeness, superficiality, and artificiality. All right. And when I'm talking about fakeness and superficiality and artificiality in music, I mean there being sound that is doctored and overproduced and thus not very realistic, and oftentimes these days not even made by musical instruments, right, but rather very synthetic and artificial sounding, or perhaps not even created from scratch by the supposed musical artists themselves, but rather just being samples that were actually created by someone else. As to musicians such as myself, the music these days sounds extremely fake and artificial because of these things. All right. And when I'm producing my music, I like to stop at a certain point before it becomes overproduced. Like just earlier today with two different songs, I actually dialed back the production after, adding certain effects. I was like, this is supposed to make it sound better and everyone's doing it these days, but I just don't like it. I do not want it to be this overproduced. And that is the way that punk rockers approach their music. All right. So, for instance, punk rockers may not be the best guitarists, but at least they are playing musical instruments at all and not just using a sound bank and samples from other people. Also, not doctoring their sound that comes from their guitars either, as some guitarists do, and is so much more that can be said about most musicians these days. Punk rockers' sounds come from the heart and are real, okay? And some of these guitarists in the pop rock genre who always sound perfect are having their sounds extremely doctored and overproduced, and that's the only reason they sound perfect, not because they are actually perfect guitar players. Then when they try to reproduce their music live, it doesn't even sound right because of the fact that their sound is almost 100% studio wizardry. It's all just studio mechanics and production value, not musical talent. But punk rock is easy and simple enough to play, so that you know when you go to a punk concert what you are going to get. It is going to sound like it does on the album, unlike so many other quote unquote musical artists can't actually play in real life like it sounds on the album, which is just so inauthentic and fake and something that I hate. I really hate falling in love with songs from a studio album and then going to see someone live, or even just finding a concert online or buying a concert video and listening to my favorite songs and being just let down, having it not produce the same feeling in me because they obviously can't do what they did in the studio live because it's not actually them, right? That's not what they sound like. It is their producers and studio executives that created this sound. Speaking of the authentic sound and punk being very pure and simple, punk is easy enough to play that if you were looking to pick up the guitar and start trying to become a guitarist, playing punk rock is the very best place to start. All right, so I'm just throwing that out there for anyone who wants to become a guitarist. And why is punk so opposed to these high levels of production value? I mean, some of you are out there thinking, well, I like the way pop sounds, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as it sounds good, right? There can't be anything wrong with that. And why should you be opposed to something being produced in such a way that makes it sound better? Well, that's not really the issue, right? That's kind of an oversimplification, and I'm basically quoting people who I've spoken to about this when I say that. So my retort is why should everything have to be overproduced and sound so perfect, even to the point of it being, superficial or artificial sounding, when that's not natural? That's not the way things really sound. Why should a guitar, especially, or a musical instrument, be produced to the point where it no longer sounds like a guitar or whatever musical instrument it is, right? Or why would you even take it a step further and use an electronic synthesizer sound that is meant to sound like an instrument but doesn't and just sounds artificial. It's something that some musical artists started doing because, like, on a guitar there's going to be imperfections, right? There's going to be like little squelches. There's going to be like the sound of strings when you move your hand across a fretboard. There's going to be that sort of sliding sound. There's going to be fret buzz here and there. There's going to be little minor imperfections. But why should these things matter to the point where you need to try to filter them out by overproducing or even not using a guitar at all, instead using a keyboard synthesizer set to guitar sounds or something like that? In reality, nothing is perfect, right? So why not just be real? Because when pop music tries to sound all perfect, all it achieves is a new level of artificiality and fakeness and deception. Okay, reality is far from perfect. It's rather the opposite. It's often messy and chaotic. So instead of trying to create fake things that ostensibly seem perfect but aren't really, why not embrace imperfection and the flawed nature of things? Okay, this is what punk music does. So what if it doesn't always sound pretty? Life's not pretty. The world is not pretty. Okay, you have got to learn to see the beauty in flaws. All right, you've got to be able to appreciate the beauty of things, not just in spite of their flaws, but because of them. All right, you need to embrace the natural and imperfect nature of things. This is what punk does. It sees things that are imperfect and says, so what that it's not perfect? It's good enough for me. I can appreciate it just the way that it is, which is something we've learned to do, us punks, by living hard lives in a very ugly world, which only helps us to appreciate beauty so much more than the types of people who live in like upper class society and are oftentimes very wealthy. And these are the types of people who need everything to seem perfect, even though it's really just fake and artificial, listening to music like pop, because everything about their lifestyle is just fake. It's like polished to look perfect when in actuality it's not. And all they're doing is deceiving themselves and basically in denial of the fact that that's not reality. Punks, on the other hand, have learned to find glory in chaos. And why not? Sometimes punk music is noisy, but so is the world. And unlike the crazy cities we live in, at least the noise in punk music is creative and artistic. And yes, noise can be art and can be an integral element to music. And to think otherwise is to be an ignorant Philistine. And if you need to learn more about the elements of music and how to analyze it as an art form so that you can better appreciate it, check out the video I made giving you a free lesson on that, linked below. But if there's one thing you should take away from the punk ethos, it's to just be real. Don't be fake. And don't try to seem perfect when you're not. Nothing is. You'll never feel right about yourself that way, or your life, when you are acting like something that you're not. And so as long as we're getting real here, let's talk about the next thing. Principle number 2 of the punk scene, which is nonconformity, rebellion, and anti-establishment messages. Punks refuse to conform to the arbitrary norms of society, and instead we challenge them. Our messages say, fuck the government, fuck authority, fuck big business and capitalism, fuck the status quo, and fuck the whole system. Punks rebel against all of the establishment and often society in general, and open the door to alternative ways of living and creative and artistic expression. And why not? Society is unnatural and fake. The whole status quo and everything else in it is all bullshit. Everyone in society is just a bunch of slaves to the capitalist system, which has robbed them of any autonomy and independent thinking. And so, of course, punks rebel against this. They do not want to be cogs in a big machine. They want individuality, free thought, liberty, and such. Some punks can be very political and often anarchistic, such as the punk song I wrote called Anarchy, Fuck the State, linked below. While other punk music has a nihilistic, fuck it all attitude of reckless abandon, such as the song I wrote called Party Till Death, also linked below. These types of messages appear in punk music because the social system is failing us here in society. So we punks have given up on it and are pushing back against all of the norms that have been forced upon us, that have never served our best interest, but only kept us down. which is exactly what one should do in such a situation. So you obviously can't blame us. So we punks write music with messages of disobedience, resistance, and rebellion, not just to express our feelings and attitudes towards a way of life that has done us no good and thus we are against, but to try to get the masses of NPCs to wake up and free themselves from their robotic lives of slavery. This is a lot more virtuous than the types of messages we see in pop music, which only turns people into NPCs and rots their brains. And this is why you shouldn't just judge a music based upon its sound, but you should really read the lyrics so you can evaluate it based upon its messages. And a lot of the punk messages may not sound very nice, but if you actually read them, you may find yourself agreeing or at least appreciating what they have to say. And I'm sure we can all agree that there's a distinct point where you should no longer go along with the crowd, but instead should say, you know what? Fuck this. And it's the punk attitude that motivates you to say, fuck it, to anything that deserves it. And with the state of the world as it is today and all the bullshit we're having to deal with, you have got to ask yourself, am I tolerating too much? Isn't there a lot of shit in my life I should be saying, fuck this too? At what point are you going to realize that you need to just say, fuck it? Maybe if you listened to more punk music, you'd have a better source of inspiration that you need to do so, rather than the pop music that's been brainwashing you into conformity and submission. And then lastly, the third principle of the punk scene is a do-it-yourself, anti-capitalist, anti-consumer attitude. You see, you don't need to buy stuff designed by someone else, especially when you can do it yourself for cheaper and use your own creativity in order to custom make something to fit your own criteria for it, thus making it oftentimes better than if you were to buy it made by someone else. Even if it won't look as good as something expensive and designer made, at least then it's your own, and you have crafted something that you can take pride in, that represents your own personality, rather than just advertising some other designer's products like a mindless consumer. Besides, isn't the only reason you buy stuff because you don't know how to make it yourself? And wouldn't you rather have something that was made personally by you and customized to your own liking that you can take pride in? I think that especially with the economy failing under late stage capitalism and all of our consumer goods being enshittified by inflation and shitflation, more people now can appreciate this sentiment these days, as we are feeling so disenfranchised with the marketplace and becoming very displeased with the products we buy, which have become so shitty over the lowering and lowering of quality over the past several years, while the costs only continue to go up year after year. So there's no better time than now to adopt the punk's DIY attitude and start learning how to make your own stuff wherever, it's important to you. For instance, last year, I decided to rebuild a broken down old guitar of mine that was my first guitar, and I didn't want to just get rid of it. And while it was a long learning process with a big learning curve that took the better part of a whole entire year and wasn't easy, especially at certain points, and took a lot of time and going through educational materials and going to different stores, doing a lot of online shopping for parts, and then screwing up and having to redo things and then having to bring it into a professional to consult with him about it. It was a very long process, but it was also very rewarding and extremely fulfilling, especially in the end when it finally was done and I got to play it. And I'm so happy with the result, which you can see pictured. And you can also check out a more in-detail video I did about it, linked below, right? But that's just one thing, a musical instrument that has a lot of sentimental value to me, right? But there's so many different skills that it would be so much better to learn and do ourselves and then hire someone to do for us. So don't be afraid to learn new skills and roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty doing some good old-fashioned hard work to create the kinds of stuff that you want in your life, rather than relying upon the bullshit being peddled to us by these big evil corporations these days, none of which is any good and won't last very long before we have to buy another and often even more expensive yet shittier product, right? Fuck that. I'd rather make my own stuff. It ends up being so much higher quality, and it's the only material goods I end up being happy with. I mean, like almost every product that I buy, I'm disappointed in, right? It is not worth the cost. It is low quality, it breaks down very soon after I buy it, or it has problems from the start. Modern consumerism is so disappointing at best, and at worst, it's frustrating or even enraging. Oftentimes, you end up losing huge amounts of money when you make expensive purchases. For instance, like this big screen TV that I bought online that I couldn't send back because it was too big. But it's got so many flaws in the screen, and so I paid all this money for a new TV that was, just a waste. And unfortunately, this is something I can't make for myself. But it's an example of why any product that I can make for myself these days, I do. Times you can't, for instance, sometimes doing things like secondhand shopping, going to thrift stores for clothes, for instance, and then if they don't fit you right, making alterations and customizing them. Like, for instance, Cruella. In the movie Cruella, she was an obvious punk. She took old clothes from the thrift stores and consignment shops, and she customized them and made them look just so amazing. And that's exactly what I have done with any of the suits that you see me wearing in the slideshows of my songs. Those all came from thrift stores or consignment shops or were hand-me-downs from my father. I have never bought a new suit. I always get them secondhand and then just have them tailored to fit myself if needed. So that's a really good idea to do, especially with clothes like that are extremely expensive. I mean, new suits cost hundreds of dollars. And why pay that when you can get them at a thrift store for like $10 or $20 or sometimes even less, or just, get them from people who are just giving them away because they don't fit anymore. And then all you have to do is pay to have them tailored to your body. Or, for instance, buying old stuff and upgrading it. Right? Like, for instance, stuff from a pawn shop, appliances or whatever, or cars for car people. They could buy an old car and then upgrade it and make it even better. Doing these types of things is very punky, and it is also very pragmatic and intelligent, which are good qualities that will get you much further in life than just being a mindless capitalist consumer drone, spending all your money and even going into debt to keep using an endless stream of bullshit bad products that don't last and just end up getting thrown out sooner rather than later and leave you with nothing to show for it. So that's why us punks have such an anti-consumer, anti-capitalist attitude, and we prefer to do it yourself. So those are the three main basic tenets of the punk scene. And if you think you don't like the sound of most punk music, perhaps you can at least now understand the artistic integrity and value of it, and the entire attitude and lifestyle behind the punk scene and its music. But of course, punk is not a small or limited genre. It's actually rather expansive and has several subgenres and crossovers that you may appreciate, and a lot of whom may not even sound like what you think of as punk. For instance, not all punk is as heavy and hard rock style as you may think, but a lot of it can be much more mellow. You see, punk rock has actually been around for over 50 years now, even longer than metal, which actually evolved out of punk, and both of which evolved out of garage rock in the late 60s. And so most people do not realize this, but some of what we now call classic rock was actually the original punk, or what is now called proto-punk, such as Iggy Pop and his band The Stooges, who I covered the famous hit by called I Wanna Be Your Dog, linked below, or the British punk bands The Ramones and The Damned. And if you're into classic 70s and 80s hard rock bands, you may want to check out the old Guns N' Roses punk cover album called The Spaghetti Incident, which is really good, especially the song Human Being. That one's really fun and upbeat. And speaking of classic British punk, there's also the Sex Pistols, The Clash, and Buzzcocks, who have a very classic rock type of sound. But for more modern rock, there's also very mainstream pop punk, such as Green Day, whose first few albums are really good, but after that, they really went to shit. And Blink-182, who I never got into. And there's plenty of other bands, many of whom are more mainstream and which a lot of people like, who don't like other forms of punk, because, of course, it's more poppy, including pop rock bands that aren't fully classified as pop punk, but do cross over into that territory and have a punk origin or influence, such as the Foo Fighters, who is my favorite mainstream pop rock band. And Dave Grohl is an extremely, incredibly talented musician with punk roots, of course, with Nirvana, who can play every instrument in the band and did so for his first Foo Fighters album after his work as the drummer for Nirvana was over. And speaking of Dave Grohl and Nirvana, there's also grunge music, which again is not technically punk or even a subgenre of it, but is related to punk and has many of its elements, but is a bit more laid back and mellow, and also has heavier distortion, which can tend to be, more depressive and angsty. and has produced bands such as Nirvana, who was a very punky grunge band and that everyone obviously loves, especially, more and more as time goes on, though most people only know the poppy radio songs of and do not delve into the deeper tracks of, or even know their first album, Bleach, which is both their grungiest and punkiest, and most raw, pure, and authentic, and my personal favorite, which I highly recommend, and which I covered 2 of my favorite songs from that I've linked below. This is one of the few albums out there that I like every song from, so I highly recommend you check out the whole album. All right, and then there's also Soundgarden, who is one of my favorite bands, which was led by one of my favorite singer-songwriters, the late Chris Cornell, who was a beautiful musical artist who wrote really amazing songs, a few of which I'm covering and will also link below. Soundgarden, again, is not punk, but they have done some punk-style songs and, have punk influences. And then there's also Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains. They're both grunge bands that are, kind of punky and pretty good. Or even Neil Young, who is said to be the godfather of grunge and who has a very classic rock sound since he was around back in those days, starting with the folk group Crosby, Stills, and Nash. But then there's also ska punk, ska being a type of music made with brass horns, and thus elements of big band music, as well as reggae, which is a type of ska in itself. And when you combine those styles with punk, what you get is really cool, and has produced popular bands such as Sublime, the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, Smash Mouth, and Real Big Fish. All of whom I'm sure you've heard on the radio, as they all have a lot of popular hits. And from a musical standpoint, they are good musicians, but none of whom I really like, as they all just kind of sound silly to me. Though I do appreciate the artistic value of their music and ska in general. And because I like punk, big band, and reggae, I have found some other less mainstream ska punk bands that I really do like, such as Rancid, Operation Ivy, and Less Than Jake, though these bands are far more punky and less ska, so many of their songs do not have the brass section. And then there's also emo, which is short for emotional, and is a descriptive title for the type of music that it is. It's a emotional type of punk for the hyper-emotional teenagers out there, which has bands such as My Chemical Romance and Jimmy Eat World, in which I never got into because I was into much darker, heavier stuff when I was an emotional teen, like heavy metal and goth music, though there are actually goth punk bands too, such as The Damned, Bauhaus, Joy Division, or The Cure. And it's worthy of note that most of these bands are also technically what are called post-punk music, which is an experimental offshoot of punk that is related to new wave and is really groovy and barely sounds like punk at all, as it incorporates elements of funk, jazz, and electronic music, so you may like it if you're into that stuff. And it has its own range of styles, from that which is more rhythmic and danceable, such as Gang of Four, to that which is more spaced out and psychedelic, such as Bauhaus, to that which is more mellow, poppy, and melancholic, such as The Cure, who has a very new wave sound. And while all of these bands that I've listed so far are not really that hard and heavy, for people who do not want their rock to be less hard, but are more into really heavy music, like forms of metal, there's hardcore punk, which is my favorite form of punk. And it has its own number of subcategories, such as grindcore, thrashcore, and fastcore, which can be quite intense, such as bands like Bad Religion, who is more of a melodic hardcore and skate punk band, thus it isn't really that hardcore, but more like hard rock. Bad Brains, who also incorporates reggae and thus isn't as intense as the following bands who are. So if you're looking for the most hardcore stuff, my picks are the bands Minor Threat, Infest, Extortion, Ground, and Ripcord. These are bands that are really hardcore and some of my personal favorites that I love to work out to because their crazy, chaotic sound just gets me so energized and pumped up, especially if I'm feeling tired. It's better than taking a shot of pre-workout. Just put on one of these super intense, crazy albums and I am ready to go. So if you're into fast, heavy music, check them out. You may like them, and even if you don't, worst case scenario is you've broadened your horizons. And if you're into that kind of sound, you should also check out the famous heavy metal band Slayer's hardcore punk album called Indisputed Attitude, which they put out back in 1994, and is actually how I got into hardcore punk. That's a really interesting find that you may want to check out. And then there's also a few outlier punk bands that are worth mentioning that have done some really innovative stuff that's hard to categorize, such as Green Jelly, who is a satirical and theatric band containing Maynard James Keenan and Danny Carey from Tool, which is the band they had before they then went on to form Tool. And this is a band whose music is not to be taken at all seriously and is just meant to be very entertaining and fun and humorous and comical. And whose first album was actually entirely made up of comical music videos. All right, so their album that is sound only was actually called the Soundtrack. And if you're into theatrics, there's an even more theatrical and also heavier band called Guar, who wear monstrous costumes and pretend to be these predatory aliens from outer space who are here to destroy the Earth. So that's a lot of fun if you hate everything in the world as much as I do. And there's plenty more subcategories within and between these ones that I've listed, such as the Misfits, who pioneered what's called horror punk. And then there's also some very amazing artsy alternative rock bands who are related to punk or have punk influence, such as the Queens of the Stone Age, who are one of my favorite bands, maybe the most favorite, who are just some of the best alternative rock musicians out there, in my opinion, and whom the frontman of, Joshua Homme, incorporates a lot of punk rock style rhythm guitar playing and singing into his music, and who I highly recommend and have also done the most covers of, which I'll also be posting some of below. So check those out if you like artsy alternative music. But now, in conclusion, finally, if you are the type of person who thinks they don't like punk, I'd suggest you try to keep an open mind and just, dip your foot in the water here and there, because there's just so much out there to be appreciated artistically. And small-mindedness is not a good quality and is only going to limit you in life, especially when it comes to art and entertainment and also developing do-it-yourself skills, right? Or being free thinking. And so being open-minded about these things can not only help you to develop new skills that will make you more successful, but it can also help you to become more intellectual and more intelligent, which can also help you to be more successful in life. But also, this is going to help you to become more authentic and true to yourself, which is perhaps the most important thing in your life. Or even if these important things aren't important to you, aren't things that you value, at the very least, when it comes to entertainment and the arts, keeping an open mind just makes these things so much more enjoyable. When you approach any of these things with an open mind, you're going to be all the better for it, and you're going to have a better experience. For instance, I am saying all of this not even as someone who considers myself technically and officially a punk, though it's not really a technical or official thing, but I don't really consider myself that much of a punk, right? As punk music isn't really my primary style that I play, and it's not certainly my style of dress, but just as someone who is passionate enough about music to give everything a chance, while I don't like a lot of the punk music that I've heard, perhaps most of it, I have found a lot of bands and songs that have really enriched my life, and some of which have become new favorites when I gave them a chance. And I've also gained a lot as a musician through incorporating punk influences into my playing and singing style. And also, the whole punk attitude has enriched my life and helped me to become a better person and have better experiences, right? So I think that anyone who is closed-minded to this entire style of music, just because they've heard some of it and not liked it, you're going to be really missing out, because there's just so much more out there to be exposed to that you really could like and could really enhance your life. Also, beyond that, I think that with the state of the world as it is today, we could all benefit from a more punky attitude towards society and our life in it in general, and that it could help us actually create the change that we want to see in the world, right? And where better to get the inspiration you need to do that than from some punk music. So check out the songs I've written linked below, and you can look up any of the artists I listed that you don't already know and expand your musical horizons. And if you have any punk bands that you love, which I didn't list, be sure to leave them below in the comments section and let us know what specific style of punk they represent. And if you could provide links to your favorite songs by them, that would be great. And if you are looking for a type of music that's even heavier and more intense than punk rock, stay tuned for a 2-part series I'm going to be doing on the art of heavy metal, which has influenced me even more than punk and is, one of the styles of guitar-based music that I love the most, and which, as I said, evolved out of punk rock and has very similar messages, but gets much more dark and hardcore and has much more talented guitarists too, who don't just do rhythm guitar, but lead guitar and solos as well, which are really impressive. So make sure you are subscribed and that your subscription is set to all so you'll be notified when those videos are released, and I will talk to you more there.